we're down in Alexander Dock here, in front of HMS Caroline, a ship that's been here since 1924.
HMS Caroline, Pete, was the first of a class of 6 new warships, and they were called Caroline class light cruisers, designed around about 1912 time, around about the same time as the Titanic was on her maiden voyage. She was laid down in January 1914, launched in September of that year, and went to sea operationally in December. That makes her the fastest built major warship the Royal Navy's ever had. She served operationally for several years, most notably at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, the biggest naval battle of the First World War. She's the only ship of her type left in the world from the Battle of Jutland. Eventually her operational service came to an end in 1922 and she was laid up on the south coast of England awaiting a future. Then in 1924 the decision was taken to form a naval division, a Royal Naval Reserve Division in Belfast, and she was sent here to be the headquarters ship of the Naval Reserve Division. Came here in 1924, slightly after partition, so very sensitive time. Her guns were removed so that there was no perceived threat to anybody. She was here purely for training reservists to support the regulars in time of war, and she performed that role right through to 2009, almost without a break. The only difference being in the Second World War, she was actually the headquarters ship of the Royal Navy in Belfast itself, not in a reserve unit, but in an operational role.
When I came down to the Caroline, it was just immediately after the air raids. So the city was in quite a mess, and Caroline was over in Dock then. Basically, it was administration. Caroline was used for during the war. Mostly the papers to do with the sailors on board the ships. We had to be sure you had the correct papers for the ships that were going out.
Well, Martin, we're on the deck of HMS Caroline now, at the bow. Just tell me a bit about the design of the ship.
The ship was designed to be a scout. She was designed to be fast and agile and to be able to get ahead of the main battle fleet, big battleships, 20, 30,000 tons. She was designed to get out so she could stay within distance, spot the enemy, and then report back by signal that the enemy was sighted so that the Admiral could decide his strategy for engagement of the enemy. She was a disposable ship. She
would have played the role that a modern-day destroyer would have played, a fast ship.
Very much that. She is long, she's slim. She had 4 shafts, she had big sort of steam turbines. This ship was designed to be a racehorse, really fast through the water, but probably not the best sea-keeping ship the Navy's ever built.
So she didn't want to get into engagements with heavier ships?
She wanted to get close, she wanted to find out what the enemy looked like, how many there were, report it back. And if she could fire torpedoes, that was the main offensive weapon of this ship against a bigger ship, fire the torpedoes and get out of there. If she needed to defend herself or to engage with ships of a similar size, she had 6- and 4-inch guns to be able to do that.
This was in the days before radar, which plays a key role in naval battles now, but in those days, I mean, there was no radar, it was Mark 1 eyeball.
Yes, it was. Radio may have been used, but the Royal Navy relied on centuries-old tradition of line of sight, flag hoists, and making signals to each other through flashing lights. That was the accurate way of communicating with each other at the Battle of Jutland.
Just looking back down the ship, Martin, the bridges behind us here, very, very exposed compared to a modern-day warship.
Yes, Caroline-class ships were very agricultural because of the way they were designed and the job they were designed to do. The bridge was exposed, so people were wearing layers of clothes, duffel coats, lots of hot drinks, and of course the lookouts were at the top of the mast, guys with the best eyesight and those who were able to see the furthest. The mast height was as high as it could possibly be in the ship, and it gave extra vision of about an extra 5 or 6 miles over the horizon. That was the advantage that a high mast gave.
And obviously in those days the lookouts would have been looking for smoke.
Most ships in that time were coal-fired or oil-fired, and therefore smoke was an unavoidable hazard of being in a ship at sea. That's exactly what we were looking out for.
the convoys that were going up to Russia. Some of them suffered rather badly with icing. One particular one didn't come, I remember it quite well, didn't come back. It apparently iced over and turned over. They were all lost. It was terribly sad. As convoys came in, you sort of heard whether they were all back or not. Sad, really. I remember the day the Hood was sunk. We knew she was in battle because on the upper deck, the signals were coming in there, and then we heard she was lost.
I know that was a terrible loss of life.
Dreadful day, it really was.
The wheelhouse in a ship like this in 1914 was a mechanical place. This is where all of the controls and the instructions were passed to the engineers and those who were operating the ship. So we've got the ship's compass for direction, so we've got bearing, and we know where we're heading to. We've got telegraphs for the port and starboard engines so that we can give independent instructions through mechanical linkages about the amount of power we want and which way we expect the propellers to be turning. And here we've got the rudder control table. This was an electromechanical device very, very early on in the 1914 period, where the ship would be able to send electrical signals right back after the steering compartment so that the men operating down there would know which way to turn the ship's rudder. Very important communication tool. Above here is the flying bridge, as it's known in a ship. It's totally exposed to the elements. That's where the captain and all of his senior staff would be, looking at the enemy, making sure they know where all of their own fleet is, and sending signals through voice pipes to this control area, which then forwards them on through the ship.
Now let's go up onto the flying bridge then and have a look at the views from up there. Well, Martin, we're up now on the flying bridge, very exposed up here, and mid-Atlantic would have been a terrible place to be.
Absolutely dreadful. We're talking about a time when everything was made of wool or cotton. You were lucky if you had layers. The guys out here were out here for 3 or 4 hours at a time, trying to keep their vision, sort of trying to see what was going on. Huge amounts of noise, smoke billowing around from the funnels behind us. So quite a difficult place to be. But this is where the ship was fought from. This is where the captain needed to be. Captain of this ship was up here for hours and hours on end, controlling what was going on and giving his directions.
And again, then above us is the crow's nest, where because of the height you got the maximum view over the horizon.
You did. That extra 20 or 30 feet made a huge difference. It was an extra 4 or 5 miles in terms of seeing early smoke from a scouting ship from the opposition fleet. Being able to position yourself ready for battle was a key strategy that everybody needed to be on top of. So the higher the mast, the greater the vision.
Her chief role was to train reserve naval officers and ratings. Britain had to provide for NATO a minesweeping force, and that minesweeping force consisted of the 10th Minesweeping Squadron, and it was controlled by the RN, but the RNR, or in those days when I originally joined, the RNVR, had to provide crews for these minesweepers. We also were training up officers of various kinds and various specializations. I mean, dentists, doctors, engineers, more than we needed for the purpose of the minesweepers, but for the general good of the Navy.
Well, Martin, now we're in one of the 3 galleys aboard HMS Caroline. Just tell us about the function of this.
This is the forward galley in the ship. This is where the majority, the junior rates of the ship's company, who were the majority of the ship's company, would have been fed. This galley would have been in operation 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, baking bread overnight, rolls, loaves, those sort of things, and then during the morning preparing food and cooking it through, so they were producing hot meals. This galley typically could have been preparing and cooking food for 200 men. The officers' mess galley back aft considerably less, maybe only 20 or 30 officers, and then the other galley for the senior rates. Food at the time, of course, there were no fridges, so most of the fresh food after a ship sailed was kept on the upper deck in screens or lockers, and beef would have been in a beef screen. Meat would have figured highly on the menu, and meat would have been sort of on the agenda every day for the ship's company. I mean, these are hard-working men who need an awful lot of calories, probably into a range of 4,000 or 5,000 calories a day to do the work they were doing.
Let's go forward in the ship now and have a look at some of the accommodation where the men stayed when they were off duty.
Okay.
Well, Martin, we're right up in the bow of the ship now. We can see the curvature of the hull here, right in the front part of the ship. We can see the rivets, which obviously formed the construction of the ship. Just explain to us what way a ship would have been built in that period.
This is the classic Titanic construction. So the designer would have had plates fabricated, bent slightly to give curvature. They would have been matched, holes would have been drilled in them, and then the hot rivets would have been put through mandrolically. One man on one side of the plate, another on the other, with a riveting gun or a riveting hammer. When the rivets go cold, of course, it pulls the metal together and you get that watertight seal. A ship like this would have had several 100,000 rivets and a number of thousands of plates. The idea of the armour was that it would give some degree of protection against a torpedo. It may not completely save the ship, but it would give the men time to escape if it did its job. Classically, though, in a ship like this, it was speed that kept the ship away from any danger.
So what would this space we're in now have been used for when the ship was active?
This is the space where the most junior of ratings in the ship would have slept, and they would have slung their hammocks in here. Literally, they would have been hooked into the deckhead, into eyelets. They'd have slept there overnight when they were off watch, and during the day when they were at work, their hammocks would have been taken out onto the upper deck to be aired, or they'd have been rolled up and folded out of the way. The last thing you need when you're in action is hammocks and debris all over the place. So they're incredibly tidy people. That's the way the Navy operates.
Yeah, well, I was in the naval section of the Combined Cadet Force of Campbell College. So at the age of 13, 1953, we were based down here. We came down here for training in seamanship, and we fired rifles on the small bore range with the starboard side there as you come aboard, which is dismantled. Every cadet at that time had to shoot the Empire test with a rifle. And I actually have my marksman's badge. We also did drill in the main drill hall, of course, and learnt knots and splices. And there were boats tied up to the boom on the port side forward there. We learnt to pull and sail both cutters and whalers.
Let's go down below into the engine rooms and see the driving force of the ship.
Well, Pete, this is the main access to the main machinery space. That's where the ship's engines are situated, the largest compartment within the ship. Down there waiting for us is Lieutenant Commander Martin Browning, who was previously an executive officer of HMS Caroline and something of an expert in these engines.
We're in the engine room, standing here in front of one of the 4 Parsons reduction turbines that the ship is fitted with. We believe that they're the only in-situ turbines of this era left anywhere in the world. They were quite unique and at the forefront of engineering at their time, particularly because of the design of them, and you'll note that there isn't a separate gearbox. Everything is contained within this turbine. They're driven by steam. It's best described as a turbine is rather like looking at the front of a jet engine at a city airport, and of course it's the steam pushing against the fan blades inside these turbines that spins them, and then from that spins the shaft with the propeller at the stern. Ship has 4 shafts. Each shaft has its own turbine. And here on my left-hand side is one of the condensers, which basically converts the used steam back to water so it can be used again in the boilers. About 40,000 shaft horsepower. They would push this ship at about 28 knots. On time trial, when she was built in 1914, she was actually recorded at 29.5 knots, which is absolutely phenomenal for a steam-powered, oil-fired ship. That was almost unheard of. Indeed, a modern warship today generally runs around at not much more than 29, 30 knots. So to be doing this almost 100 years ago is absolutely amazing. She carried somewhere between 500 and 1,000 tons of fuel oil in various tanks around the ship, some to each side of the engine room, and indeed we're standing on top of some more of her oil fuel tanks as well.
And there was no ship-to-ship refuelling in those days. When fuel got low, she had to return to port, which meant if she was involved in an engagement, she still had to return to port.
Yes, that's very true. It's a comparatively modern technique to refuel at sea. She would have had to have come alongside and taken fuel from shore supply. If she would have been going into action, she would have been ensured that she would have been totally fueled before sailing for that action. But on a long patrol, yes, she would have been worried about fuel, not only from the point of view of her endurance and being able to operate in action, if you like, but of course as you're using up the fuel, you have to replace it with seawater or you start to have stability problems as well.
And we're actually below the waterline here as well.
We are, yes.
So
yes.
if she was torpedoed, this was absolutely the place you didn't want to be?
Absolutely the place you didn't want to be. As you've discovered yourself, access to and from this engine room is quite difficult at the best of times. So if you're at sea, rolling around, heavy weather, or torpedoed and the water's coming in, there'd be steam, you're going to have casualties from steam burns, and you've got to get out. Not a good place to be.
There apparently is a ghost in the engine room in Caroline. This was seen by one of the ratings a great many years ago, and he gave a fairly fair description of what he saw. And it turned out that one of the salient parts about the thing was that this ghost had his cap on and a wing collar, which wasn't very common, and this particular rating wouldn't have known that that was the way officers of days gone by were dressed. And it was eventually and subsequently found out that in actual fact somebody had either died or was killed in the engine room. And nobody's ever seen since, but possibly the reason for that is there's never anybody in the engine rooms now. They were restored by a very keen staff officer a number of years ago, but he didn't report seeing anybody there.
Well, Martin, we're down in the steering compartment of the ship now. Just explain what went on here.
Okay, Pete, this compartment is right at the aft end of the ship, about as close to the back of the ship as you can get. It's underwater, so it's surrounded by water on the top. There are 2 propellers below us, would have been, sort of action stations churning away, creating huge amounts of noise. This compartment would have been manned in action stations by up to 12 men, so 6 to turn the wheels, 2 for instructions, 1 for supervision, and a spare man in case somebody went over. The heat down here would have been quite fierce. The hatch would have been sealed because we're below the waterline, so if the ship took any damage, they wouldn't have been able to get out quite easy. This would have been a horrendous place for these men to be at action stations. Lots of noise, everything else going on at the same time. Quite a frightening place. So down here, they would have been listening for orders and ready for any mechanical breakdown whatsoever to keep the ship fighting and floating and moving. That was their job. You needed the best men that you had down here.
No visual references below the waterline. There'd been quite a lot of movement here, so seasickness would have been a problem.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, most men can train their minds to avoid seasickness, but in really bad conditions on a difficult day, with the lights flickering on and off, it only takes one man to be ill, and that can set the rest off. So it would have been quite dreadful.
I was a part of the permanent staff, and our task here was to, apart from maintaining the Carrick, was to train the R&Rs for seagoing duties. That involved maintaining the minesweeper, because each division, there was 11 divisions in the UK, and each had a minesweeper attached to it. And our main task was to maintain the minesweepers.
You got the boat ready for sea for the R&Rs to use, and when it came back, you fixed what they managed to break. Plus, you had a planned maintenance system. All warships have a planned maintenance system, so there's daily stuff, weekly stuff, monthly stuff.
You would get faults, but they wouldn't tell you how it came about, so they concocted a story. So when you went to rectify the defect, you say, well, it can't be that, it can't be that. So it actually made your job a little bit more difficult than if it had told you the truth at the start.
Our commander, MCM 10 commander, used to say, our job here is they bend and we mend.
Well, Martin, here we are in the wardroom in HMS Caroline. This part of the ship would have been exclusive to the officers.
The wardroom, as we call it in the naval service, is where the officers dined. It's where they would have had their recreation, some easy chairs, and they would have been served their meals here by the wardroom stewards. Other members of the ship's company would only have been allowed into this area either if they were on duty or by special permission. It was exclusively the officers' territory.
In Caroline's long history, this room's seen some pretty amazing parties.
It's seen some great mess dinners. Every year we celebrate the Battle of Trafalgar. That's a naval tradition for the last 200 plus years. We have been known to have the odd party as well, and some fairly unique games as well. Dinners for us are all very formal. We wear our best uniforms, our medals, sort of the best china, everything we can to commemorate our heritage and our traditions in the naval service, which go back several hundred years. That's why we're called the senior service. In terms of our party games, Caroline is famous for one, and that's called the Scuttle Run. Scuttle Run is something that takes place normally when, or used to take place, normally when drink had been taken and people were feeling a little bit braver. And it involved the willing participants going out through a scuttle, such as this, body and all, up onto the upper deck above us, across to the other side of the ship, back in through a porthole similar to this, or a scuttle on either side into the wardroom, and it was a timed run. If you lost bits of uniform or damaged yourself on the way, that was your fault. This suite of cabins was built just before the outbreak of the Second World War, when it looked as though war was quite imminent, and the Royal Navy realised that HMS Caroline would have a fundamental role to play in terms of port operations and controlling shipping. They needed to modify the ship again. They'd built the drill hall in 1924, and now they needed to accommodate the senior officer. So they took away some of the structure from the after gun deck, which is what this cabin sits on, and they built this structure. So it's been here for over 70 years. It contains this cabin, which is where the captain and his senior officers would have gathered and worked as he required, a dining cabin, a night cabin for him to sleep and change in, and also a small bathroom just behind the night cabin. So totally self-contained, and the captain could have stayed here for as many weeks as he needed to get the job done during the Second World War.
A lot of information traffic going through here, very secretive, very hush-hush, a lot of security.
That's right. The ship wasn't located where she is at the moment. She was over on the other side of the harbour in Milewater Basin, which was a secure location for her. But from there, the port admiral and the captain in command of the ship at the time would have known what was going on and what needed to be done. This was the home of the Royal Navy as such in Northern Ireland at that time.
Well, Martin, we're in the drill hall now aboard HMS Caroline. Behind us, Caroline's battle honours. Just talk us through those.
Battle honours are awarded to a ship if she has been engaged in a battle. You couldn't just be close to it, you actually had to be part of it. The previous ship, HMS Caroline, was in service round about Nelson's time, about 1805, 1806. And in the few years after Trafalgar, that ship won 3 different battle honours. This ship, of course, was commissioned in 1914, and she won her sole battle honour at the Battle of Jutland in June 1916. In that battle, the greatest battle at sea during the First World War, fought between the Royal Navy and the German High Seas Fleet. The two fleets engaged each other at the Heligoland Bight, which is off the coast of Denmark. A large battle ensued between the major warships and some of the smaller ones. And after the battle had ended, the Germans always claimed a victory because they'd sunk more Royal Navy ships. However, they were the ones that went back into port and never came out again to pose a threat to the Royal Navy, therefore allowing Britannia to rule the waves for the remaining 2 years of the First World War. She had her claim to fame in what was really an hour or two of action on the second day of the battle, when she was told to engage a larger ship than herself with torpedoes. She got in as close as she could dare get in, fired at torpedoes, then tried to get away and came under direct fire. But she lived to tell the tale, and that's how we come to see her here today.
Here we are on the quarterdeck of HMS Caroline, where in a few weeks the final acts of her naval career will be played out.
Well, on the 31st of March, Pete, it will be the very last ceremony ever held on board this ship. It is the Navy's opportunity to say goodbye to her as she passes into her next life, which is hopefully going to be as a museum. On that day, there'll be a formal ceremony here. Our own Admiral will be here, some local VIPs, people we wish have been good to the ship, good to the ship's company. And then after that ceremony, we'll be laying up her ensign in St Anne's Cathedral, so it will be there for many, many years to come for people to go and reflect and have quiet moments, particularly those who've served in the ship. So there will still be a lasting memory, but in a quieter place than the harbour.
She's been here so long, she's part of the skyline basically in Belfast, and we've all just grown accustomed to her being here, and just so many people have passed through Naval Reserve and so on and so forth, and with cadets, and really it's just part of Belfast and should be retained as part of Belfast.
I think it's a really sad day. You know, we're standing here in the shadow of the great cranes and, you know, in the area where the Titanic left these shores. And for another ship to leave here that has such a tradition and history connection with Belfast would be very sad. 97 years of service, and we should retain it here as part of our maritime history, I feel. And there is a will there, but whether there's the money to retain it, I'm not sure.
Belfast has been this ship's home for most of her life. The thousands who've served on it are all local men and women. Caroline is a national treasure. She is an historic ship in her own right, and she's on the preservation list. She's the maritime equivalent of a Grade 1 listed building, so she needs to be preserved for the future. It's the Navy's intention to do that by passing her into ownership of the National Museum of the Royal Navy, so she will have proper care, proper custodianship. The only thing that isn't yet certain is where her final home will be. Then in 1924, the decision was taken to form a naval division, a Royal Naval Reserve Division in Belfast, and she was sent here to be the headquarters ship of the Naval Reserve Division. Came here in 1924, slightly after partition, so very sensitive time. Her guns were removed so that there was no perceived threat to anybody. She was here purely for training reservists to support the regulars in time of war, and she performed that role right through to 2009, almost without a break. The only difference being in the Second World War, she was actually the headquarters ship of the Royal Navy in Belfast itself, not in a reserve unit, but in an operational role.
When I came down to the Caroline, it was just immediately after the air raids. So the city was in quite a mess, and Caroline was over in Pollockdock then.
We're down in Alexander Dock here, in front of HMS Caroline, a ship that's been here since 1924.
HMS Caroline, Pete, was the first of a class of 6 new warships, and they were called Caroline class light cruisers. Designed around about 1912 time, around about the same time as the Titanic was on her maiden voyage. She was laid down in January 1914, launched in September of that year, and went to sea operationally in December. That makes her the fastest built major warship the Royal Navy's ever had. She served operationally for several years, most notably at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, the biggest naval battle of the First World War. She's the only ship of her type left in the world from the Battle of Jutland. Eventually her operational service came to an end in 1922, and she was laid up on the south coast of England, awaiting a future.
Basically, it was administration. Caroline was used for during the war. Mostly the papers to do with the sailors on board the ships. We had to be sure you had the correct papers for the ships that were going out.
Well, Martin, we're on the deck of HMS Caroline now, at the bow. Just tell me a bit about the design of the ship.
The ship was designed to be a scout. She was designed to be fast and agile and to be able to get ahead of the main battle fleet, big battleships, 20, 30,000 tons. She was designed to get out so she could stay within distance, spot the enemy, and then report back by signal that the enemy was sighted so that the Admiral could decide his strategy for engagement of the enemy. She was a disposable ship.
She would have played the role that a modern-day destroyer would have played, a fast ship.
Very much that. She is long, she's slim, she had 4 shafts, she had big sort of steam turbines. This ship was designed to be a racehorse, really fast through the water, but probably not the best seakeeping ship the Navy's ever built.
So she didn't want to get into engagements with heavier ships.
She wanted to get close, she wanted to find out what the enemy looked like, how many there were, report it back. And if she could fire torpedoes, that was the main offensive weapon of this ship against a bigger ship. Fire the torpedoes and get out of there. If she needed to defend herself or to engage with ships of a similar size, she had 6 and 4-inch guns to be able to do that.
This was in the days before radar, which plays a key role in naval battles now. But in those days, I mean, there was no radar. It was Mark 1 eyeball.
Yes, it was. Radio may have been used, but the Royal Navy relied on centuries-old tradition of line of sight, flag hoists, and making signals to each other through flashing lights. That was the accurate way of communicating with each other at the Battle of Jutland.
Just looking back down the ship, Martin,